Thank you for joining us today for the Conform to Christ podcast, where we seek to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ. I'm Jay Jones, and I'm here with George Mays on the greatest podcast in the world that no one listens to. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
It's Monday morning for us, Tuesday for you guys as you drive into work or, whatever you do on your Tuesday morning. And we're back in Malachi, so you want to grab a Bible, go to Malachi. We're looking at one verse today, Malachi chapter 6, and we're talking about Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. There we go. Yeah. Malachi 3, verse 6. And we're talking one verse. We're looking at, a number of things, but mainly the immutability of God, that God does not change. So I'm going to jump in today, and we'll go through it. We'll go through the sermon, and maybe we'll have, I'm sure we will. We'll have a good conversation, probably break down some good practical stuff. I think people think this stuff's not really practical. Theology's boring. We're going to make it super awesome.
I was told by many people yesterday that it was very encouraging to learn about this and to think about how it applies. So hopefully, it was.
We did a conference on the Trinity
2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah. I don't even know where that stuff's posted, man. We had conversations about it on the podcast on Free for All Fridays.
I've been asked about it, and I don't know.
Yeah,
it'd be gone forever.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But we did we captured each message. So if you want to go more in depth on this type of theology we're going to talk about today, there were like 5 sermons that had to do with various aspects of the Trinity, and I'd encourage you to jump in on that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go to Free for All Friday, scroll down, you'll find it. Yeah, that's all I can tell you. Yeah, it was good stuff.
Yeah.
So it's always good. People are always like, we've got like a 3-week break. What should we do? And I'm always like, let's do the Trinity and something.
Trinity's just always your go-to.
Let's do the Trinity and something. Yeah. The Trinity is the greatest. What can you say? The greatest.
Yeah, there's so much that we could say. Yeah. I
really feel like, and I don't mean this in like a snooty way at all. I don't mean it in a snooty way at all. I just, Christians are missing out on so much by not really, like, trying to understand and study who God is in the Bible as a Trinity. Like Christianity is not like any religion at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because our God's not like any other.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I remember this probably would have been almost probably 8 years ago. I went back to Southern has an alumni academy.
Mm-hmm.
They put on a free like weekend class for alumni, and they were doing one on the Trinity with Stephen Wellum, who was my systematic professor, Michael Haken, who is church history, and Bruce Ware.
Mm-hmm.
And this was right around when the EFS stuff was starting to kind of ramp up, the eternal functional subordination of the Son.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went out there, and it's really interesting, just lectures from all 3 of them, and then they had kind of a discussion, like a Q&A. And I just remember, one, being encouraged to stick to the Orthodox historical way of communicating the Trinity against Bruce Ware. But also just the how central the Trinitarian theology is to our understanding of the Scriptures.
Right.
Of just how foundational it is. Because I think that I think that most Christians, at least most Baptists, even here in Lawton, even when we would say they might not be getting great preaching, I think they still would give an orthodox understanding of, we believe in the Trinity. We believe in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But what does what's that mean?
Yeah.
Like, what's that mean? How is that important? How does that apply? Those things, I don't think that a lot of Christians would be able to actually communicate. Like, why is the Trinity important in salvation? Why is it important in creation? How is our prayer Trinitarian? How's our worship Trinitarian? Those kind of things. How's our sanctification Trinitarian? I don't know if Christians, by and large, would be able to communicate that. So,
Right.
But coming back from that 2-day conference was really helpful for me, especially in my preaching.
Yeah.
To think about my preaching as Trinitarian.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're right. You're right. The Trinity is vitally important.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Great little book by Michael Reeves. Be an intro if you want to read it. You want to grab it.
Delighting in the Trinity.
Delighting in the Trinity. Yeah, best intro book on the Trinity you can find easily. I think we need to get more copies of it. Stick it out front for people as they want to grab it. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah. Fun fact for you. I was a little elder in training once upon a time. Michael Haken came to our church because he was, I think, advisor for my pastor's PhD. And he's like, I learned some stuff about him. He's Kurdish, I think. Did you know that?
I think I did know that.
Yeah. That's so those are people that live in the northern part of Iraq. That's their homeland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But he, I believe, is Canadian. He grew up in Canada. Yeah. Yeah, he likes tea, of course. So I'm the what I don't even know what you call him.
Aaron boy.
Aaron boy.
Yeah.
So I got to go print Michael Haken's notes off for the lecture he was going to give us on Andrew Fuller.
Okay.
Yeah, and fetch his tea and stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
That's where you start, George, in pastoral ministry.
Is it?
Printing people's notes and fetching tea.
Okay.
Yeah. Got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
It's better than starting off low man in the army, digging, which I didn't have to do this, but digging latrines and all that.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's fairly good place to start. Fetching tea. Michael Haken, yeah. Andrew Fuller introduced me to Andrew Fuller. Never really studied him, but somebody worth reading for sure. For sure, actually very brilliant.
Yeah,
very brilliant. Not as much as maybe Jonathan Edwards, but he's near that level.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he was a Baptist.
It was a 5-point Calvinist Baptist. Wrote the Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. Go ahead and read it if you want. Your mind will melt, and you'll need a nap afterward. Yep.
Sounds like me when I was studying for this sermon.
Yeah. You're studying for this sermon all week long because you're talking about some big stuff. So you started off with your sermon intro kind of giving the idea that theology doesn't really matter to, I would say, a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter to a lot of people. And what's really strange about it is they can be so adamantly against something that they have no idea what it actually is, and even arrogant in their opposition toward a thing which they don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So back at Northwest, when they tried to fire you, somebody, I guess, stood up and said, I don't know what Calvinism is, but we don't want it here, or something like that, right? Is that what they said?
Something like that, yeah.
Yep. And they confused it with Catholicism, which is the funniest thing to me ever.
It's really funny. Oh, we could not shake that accusation from people that just were dead set against Calvinism. Yeah, this one lady, because my wife she still teaches children's catechism on Wednesday nights, and for a lot of these people, when they hear catechism, they just immediately think Roman Catholic for some reason, even though catechism is just a manner of teaching. Julia, when we were trying to convince people, she even looked up. There's an old catechism to teach people the Constitution, and she posted this, and people still were like, it's Catholic. And this one lady,
the Constitution.
Yeah.
The U.S. Constitution?
Yeah, you can find a catechism that someone put together to learn the
Did
Constitution.
they say she was a communist?
No.
Because that's about as equivalent as
Oh, yeah.
saying Calvinism is Roman Catholic
that's
as
right.
saying the Constitution is communist. Like it's that
Yeah.
that level.
This one lady, she would constantly call it Catholicism, and I don't think she was doing it on purpose. I don't think she was being witty. I think she literally did not know how to pronounce Calvinism. Yeah, she would just keep calling it Catholicism, and
Well, George, I'll just be honest. I mean, Gen Zers and millennials, they take a lot of heat these days.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. The downfall of America did not happen by Gen Z and millennials. It happened by that generation who are completely ignorant of Christianity and failed to actually live it out and to disciple their children.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the blame is on pastors.
Oh, for sure.
It has to fall on pastors.
For sure.
Like they're not
100%.
And I mean, we could do a historical study. It probably stretches back at least to the Second Great Awakening and Charles Finney and decisionism and semi-Pelagian stuff that started to ramp up in the church, especially as America started spreading to the West, and you have less trained pastors, and they're just trying to get decisions. They're trying to get people to walk the aisle. The sawdust trail, come up to the front. And just over time, it's just seeped into Baptist churches, and you've got pastors that just don't teach theology. Like they teach topical stuff that they think is I guess relevant and application based. So you'll get sermons on marriage, you'll get sermons on money and things like that people feel like this is actually applicable to my life, but they don't get theology. And I think a lot of it is because pastors are not teaching theology, showing how it actually is application. We were talking about it in community group. There is no doctrine that's presented in the Bible that isn't given for application. It's all there for application. It all is supposed to affect how we live. But I don't think pastors are teaching that way, and so churches are not. They're not being taught. And so you've got people that will stand up and say, "I don't know what it is, but I don't want it in my church," which is just the most ridiculous thing that you could possibly say. I mean, I remember when I told my little church, the first church I was at as a music minister, that I wanted to go to seminary. And I remember some people scoffing at it. Like, what? Like, why do you want to go to seminary? You don't need to go to seminary.
Right.
And it wasn't because they were saying, well, you can learn that stuff without going to seminary. Like, you can read books and get training and stuff without going to seminary. That's not what they were saying. They were saying,
it's pointless.
It's pointless. Like, you don't need this.
Yeah.
And I don't know any other profession where ignorance is championed as much as in churches.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I don't know any other vocation
when I moved
where
down
you would go to someone that didn't go for training.
When I moved down here, that was the sentiment in the Baptist little organization, the association. They were definitely adamantly against seminary, and the majority of the pastors in this area have not gone. I think it's inexcusable. It's mind blowing. Imagine and this is a military community, makes it more mind blowing to me. So whenever I was called to ministry, I was in the military, and so I thought, well, I need to get training. Like you imagine like you have a whole crew of artillery people,
right?
And you're like, send it downrange.
Yeah.
We've never studied gunnery before. We have no idea, what this trajectory is, but send it. Like that's what we got.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, you wouldn't go to a doctor, you wouldn't go to a vet, you wouldn't go to a mechanic
or a lawyer.
Yeah, you wouldn't go to anybody that doesn't have. And that's not to say that you have to go to seminary. I don't think that you absolutely have to go to seminary. That's a later development, but you absolutely do need to be trained by someone that knows what they're talking about. I mean, you look at Spurgeon. Spurgeon didn't go to seminary, but also Spurgeon was brilliant.
Yeah.
But he did start his school.
And he had a photographic memory.
Yeah.
That helps.
So we don't want to use Spurgeon as the example, but he did start a school to train ministers.
Yeah, he had a pastor's college.
He had a pastor's college. They didn't go to seminary, but they were getting training.
Right.
They were getting actual training. And I think that there's no excuse for a pastor to not have training.
Well,
even if they don't spend thousands and thousands of dollars to go to seminary, I think they still need to have some training.
Right. For sure. 100%.
But you've got this anti-intellectualism in churches for some reason. I don't know. I think it's just a tactic of the enemy that it just slips in. You don't need that theology. You just need to love Jesus.
Yes.
And now you've got all kinds of ridiculous stuff going on in churches because they've just kind of kicked theology out. It's wild.
Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Oh, wait, never mind. Don't use your mind. It's all emotion.
I used a quote from Spurgeon. He said, "Those who do away with Christian doctrine are, whether they are aware of it or not, the worst enemies of Christian living. The coals of orthodoxy are necessary to the fire of piety."
Very good.
Like you're not going
As
to
always.
you're not going to be able to live a pleasing Christian life before God unless you have right beliefs, unless you're believing correctly.
Yeah.
So
I would give up a leg if I could communicate like Charles Spurgeon. You can just take me there now if there was a trade.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's jump in, George. You got one verse to read today. I don't know if we've got it on the screen. Can we throw it on the screen? One verse.
Here, let me zoom in on that one verse because it's a short one. There it is right there.
Yeah, there you go.
Verse 6.
3 verse 6.
Yep. For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore, you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed.
All right, very good. We're going to jump in. You have 3 points. If you're following along, there are 3 unchangeable statements about divine immutability. I like how you got unchangeable in there 2 times.
That was a Philip suggestion.
I like it.
That was a Philip suggestion.
That's an Easter egg.
Yeah.
3 unchangeable statements about divine immutability, and you have number 1. We're going to go, so the biblical doctrine, 1, God does not change. That's the biblical doctrine. 2, God does not change. That's the bad news. 3, God does not change. That's the good news.
This was my Puritan sermon.
Yeah.
I had one person come up to me. They were like, "You had me worried," because the first point took up like 50 minutes.
50 minutes, yeah. Yeah.
And then they were like, "I don't know
Well, if
how
you're
you're going to get. I don't know how you're going to get through the other 2." But it was the doctrine here. We don't think about immutability enough. So we've got to spend time thinking through it. What does this mean? What are some of the areas that we have to bring in, because it really is it doesn't stand alone. There's all these other things that are around it, and we have to bring it in and examine it, and then we can bring some application into it. But if we try to apply it before we actually understand it, it's going to fall apart.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's jump into it. God does not change. That's the biblical doctrine. And it's just stated very plainly.
Yeah, you can't.
God says he doesn't change.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. But you kind of broke it down and you say, okay, let's look at this. First, it means God has an unchangeable life. So let's dig into that a little bit. What do you mean by this? God has an unchangeable life. And it intersects with other areas of theology, and we'll do our best to tell you the theological terms and then to try to explain them.
Right. Yeah. So he has an unchangeable life, which means that he's eternal. It simply means that he's eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And he has aseity, which that's a word that I don't think I've ever heard in church.
That's the least used word in the church.
Yeah.
Easily. Aseity. But once you hear it, you'll never forget it.
Yeah, aseity.
Yeah.
It just means that God is self-existent.
Mm-hmm.
He is independent. He does not rely on anything outside of himself to exist. He has fullness of life in himself.
Yeah.
So aseity. So he's eternal. He has aseity. He's infinite. So he has no. He's not bound by time and space.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that means. And his life is unchanging. He doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have an end. He doesn't. There's no change in him. He simply is. That really is what aseity is. God is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Everything in the universe and that is in time space is contingent. Like even secular physicists acknowledge, look, we live in a deterministic universe.
Mm-hmm.
Something came before something, which caused something,
Right.
and you can back this all the way up till there's nothing,
Mm-hmm.
and then of course then they are like, but nothing is something. It's then they
Yeah.
get really they get really
Right.
they get really wonky at that point.
It's hard for us to grasp something that's outside of time and space because we only know time and space. Like we only know yesterday, today, tomorrow.
Right.
Even as we're talking, we're moving through this linear time. And so how do we talk about someone who is outside of time?
Right.
He doesn't have a yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He just is. He just is. It's always now. It's always now for God. And it's the same with his infinity. Like, where is God? Well, he's outside of space, so it's not even like that's not even really the right question. Like, where is he?
Mm-hmm.
Like, he everywhere. Like, he just
Right.
is.
Right.
and that's hard for us to grasp because we only know that, and so trying to communicate it's tricky.
Right.
Because he's not. I mean, the words that we use are not even adequate.
Mm-hmm.
The best I saw was C.S. Lewis's illustration of the paper.
Right.
And he used this in Mere Christianity. He said that you can imagine that you have a piece of paper, and you can make some dots on the paper. Just make like 3 dots, the left, the middle, the right, and then draw a line through it. If you were shrunk down to the size of that dot, and were on the paper, then you would just know that place. You just know that dot. Even though there's 3 dots, you wouldn't be able to see them. But if you were the one who was creating that, if you held the paper out, you were outside of the paper dimension. You'd be able to see the 3 dots and the line and everything in between and everything around it at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the best way that we can understand it is that God is outside of our dimension.
Right.
So he sees everything at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
Unchangeably. And that's mind blowing.
Yeah.
What do you even do with that?
Right. Right.
Because we only know time. We only know that once this moment is past, it's gone,
Mm-hmm.
and it's irretrievable. You can't change it. You can't go back and get it, and there's nothing you can do about the future except prepare for it. But it's out of your grasp. Also, you only have this moment. You can only live here in this space.
Right.
But with God, there's nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
He is outside of all of that, and he always has been, and he always will be, and he's unchangeable.
Yeah, that's right. I remember as I was preparing to preach at that conference, I was preaching on the doctrine of God, the Trinity, as who He is in Himself. I can't remember who wrote this, but it was really good, very practical. It's talking about prayer, like when you're praying for something going on in your life, or you're maybe struggling as a Christian at this moment in time, and you're praying for sanctification or some deal, like there's you 30 years from now, and you're praying that something will happen in these like slices of moments we experience in time. But if you're a Christian, you're praying to God who is already with you.
Yeah, right.
Wherever you're going.
Yeah.
So it's really mind blowing to think about it. Like God is there presently. at the time of your birth, now as you're praying, and at your death.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah.
Like he's there at all of them with
Yeah.
you and never
Changes.
changes,
Yeah.
so he's never not there.
He didn't have to get there.
Right.
He's just there. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're wanting to persevere, you're praying for perseverance, but he's already there at your death as people are reading, your obituary.
Yeah.
Pretty mind-blowing.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's we'll get to it. The application of all of this is not just so you can sit there and try to dissect it.
Yeah.
It does have application for how we're supposed to live.
Yeah.
So he's eternal, he's infinite, but he also has a satiety.
Yeah.
So he's self-existent.
Uh-huh.
It's in his name, and if you go back to Malachi 3:6, he appeals to his name as he's giving this doctrine. I, Yahweh, do not change. And we have to pay attention to the words that are used. So don't just skip over it because Yahweh is just in it all the time. So it's just one of the words. Like, why is he appealing to his name? Well, that's the divine name that he revealed to Moses back in Exodus 3:14.
Uh-huh.
I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, or simply he is. He just exists.
People still talk about that.
Yeah.
The name and what exactly does it mean? But
right.
it really appears to mean to be a statement of self-existence.
I think so, and it's tied to the burning bush.
Right.
So why a burning bush, right?
Yeah.
Like he didn't just like pick something at random. Like it's meant to communicate his name and his essence. He is self-existing, and so the bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed, which is not how fire works.
Right.
Fire needs material. It needs the wood and it burns it up. And when the wood's all burnt up, the fire goes out. It's the same with oxygen. It needs oxygen. If you were to deprive it of oxygen, it would go out. But this bush is on fire, but it's not consumed. The fire is just self-existing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what God's name means. It means that he is self-existing. He doesn't depend on anything outside of himself to exist. So he doesn't need us.
Right. He is his own energy source.
Yes.
Yeah.
He has life in himself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Jesus says about the Father. The Father has life in himself.
Yeah.
Right. He doesn't, and it's fullness of life. It's all of life is in God, and there's nothing that he needs. And again, that's something that we just don't. That we only know what it means to be dependent.
Right.
I mean, even as we sit here, we need oxygen, we need blood, we need our organs. My stomach is over here grumbling because I need food. We just depend on. We need gravity.
Mm-hmm.
We need Earth to be exactly where it is in the solar system, so we don't burn up or freeze. We have to have a place. We only know what it means to be dependent.
Right.
But God doesn't need any of that.
Yeah.
And forever He's been God.
Yeah.
He's been God.
Yeah. Children will ask you, well, who made God? But that's not just a kid's question. That's an unbeliever's question.
Yes.
That's a common one that
Right.
atheists or agnostics will go, well, who made God? And they just completely are not understanding this idea that the Christian God is unique
Right.
from all other religions in the world, and that he is self-existent.
Mm-hmm.
He is existence in himself.
Yeah.
And always has been.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very unique and important doctrine to understand.
And Aristotle got at this in his philosophy when he talked about the unmoved mover.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a difference. We don't want to look at Aristotle and be like, oh, he got God. Like, that's what it is. But for Aristotle, the unmoved mover was impersonal.
Right, and he's just trying to escape an infinite regress because infinite in it when it comes to time space is an absurdity.
Mm-hmm. Right. So he's got a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
He's got something that's always been, but it's not God. It's this impersonal something.
Right.
But that's not the God that we're talking about. This God who he is the unmoved mover, but he's a personal God. He's a relational God.
And only the Christian God can be this.
Mhm.
The God of the Muslims cannot be this
Because of the Trinity.
right. So they would probably try to say that, oh, our God has the same attributes as yours, but he can't, because before there's creation, he can't like actualize who he is. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
they have all these lists of attributes of Yahweh, of their God Allah, but if there's no creation, there's nothing. There's no expression of any type of relation, any type of love, any type of attributes cannot be expressed. But
Right.
in the Trinity, which is self-existent and eternal and infinite and unchanging, no creation, no problem. Because in the community of the Trinity, there's the oneness and the unchangeableness, the love, all of these attributes that we see expressed toward humanity. God has already had them all perfectly in himself and doesn't need creation to be who he is.
Yeah, really, Allah wouldn't even know what it was to create. Like he wouldn't even be able to grasp the relational, what it was like to be in a relationship, because he's just always been alone.
Right. And they don't say Allah is love.
Yeah.
Because they can't.
Right.
They might express that he's loving, but they can't say he is that.
Yeah.
But God says he is that in the Bible, in the New Testament.
Right.
So.
Yeah. This idea of aseity, it plays into how we talk about God's knowledge, because the debate between Calvinists and Arminians is, how does God know?
Right.
Like, what does it mean that he elects? What does it mean that he foreknows? And for the Arminian, they'll often say that God looks down the corridor of time and he sees who will choose him, and then he responds to that.
Right.
But that, I think that undermines aseity.
Yeah.
Because God doesn't learn. He doesn't. We've already talked about him being outside of time. So how does he look down the corridor of time?
Right.
He's already there. There's no time for him to look down. He doesn't look into the future to learn something and then respond. Calvinists would say he knows because he ordains.
Right.
Like everything that God wants to happen happens.
Yeah, that idea of foreknowledge is really like a Greco-Roman philosophical idea of foreknowledge, but the idea of foreknowledge as presented by Peter and Paul, and it's this way because of what they say about what Peter says about Jesus. Foreknowledge is based in the Hebrew idea of knowledge, which is to know or to set your love upon someone intimately. So in the Old Testament, God will say that to Israel, you of all the people of earth, only you of all the people of earth have I known. God knows every nation on earth.
Right.
He means only them. They're the only people that he has loved.
Yeah.
Goes all the way back to even to the garden that Adam knew his wife Eve. So it's the Hebrew idea of knowing in an intimate, loving way to set your love upon someone that you care for. And he says the same thing about Jesus in 1 Peter, that Jesus was foreknown before the foundation of the world. Yeah. So if you want to hold that view, that Greco-Roman view, then you just blow the Trinity apart. That to think that God looked down the corridor of time and knew Jesus is crazy. Like you lose all of Christianity completely. So, but you're right; it does completely undermine the idea that if God can learn something, He has changed.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
big consequences.
Yeah,
big consequences for theological statements that have just kind of been accepted in the mainstream. They actually, there's actually like a ripple effect. It touches. You may think it's just a small thing. God looks down the corridor of time, but it touches on major things. So we need to be really careful. We need to be accurate with that. I came across a quote. I think it was from who was it from? Bert Parsons. I can't remember if I can find it. Anyway, he said that we expect accuracy from, and this is maybe even a little outdated now, we expect accuracy from pilots
Mhm.
and from surgeons, but we don't expect accuracy from pastors.
Right.
And it just, I mean, that really is just mind-boggling. We expect that the surgeon knows exactly what he's doing, and that he has the training and he has the accuracy to pinpoint the problem and to fix the problem.
Mhm.
Same with a mechanic. You expect to go to the mechanic and they know what they can figure out what the problem is so that they can fix it.
Right.
But you go to a pastor who is supposed to be shepherding your soul, a much more important issue than going to a mechanic, and you don't care if he's accurate. You don't care if he's precise
Right.
and careful with his doctrine. It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. Yeah. Yeah, all of these doctrines intertwined, and then Peter, that's what led me to becoming a Calvinist. Like I was almost there, and I was like, still, like, you're born into the world an Arminian. That's what you're born into the world.
Yeah.
Like your default position is you think God saved you because you did something, whether that's surrender, all of these things, right? Um, so you have this view of election that's conditional.
Mm.
And it is a corridor of time view. That's like the default human position.
Yeah.
So when we read foreknowledge, because we're Westerners, we default to that philosophy. But I mean, First Peter, right, which speaks in the beginning of First Peter 1, that says that according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, obedience to Christ and for sprinkling with his blood, right? We are the elect exiles of dispersion according to the foreknowledge of God. But then you come right here. This is what did it for me. First Peter chapter 1. Speaking of Jesus, it says in verse 20, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for your sake. Right? So if you are a Christian and you're Trinitarian and you don't hold to the Hebrew idea of foreknowledge, like you have to, and that's kind of where it was. It was like, okay, is Christianity like wrong? How can Jesus be foreknown before the foundation of the world
Right.
if that's the idea that God looks through time?
Mm.
Same author, same chapter, same word.
Right.
It can't mean that.
Right.
So that's what did it for me, Giorgio. But it was John Calvin. I'm just a worshiper of
You
John
just
Calvin.
worship John Calvin.
I just worship John
Yeah,
Calvin,
just believe
George.
everything that he. I was a Calvinist long before I think I'd ever read anything from John Calvin.
Yeah. It's just a word that people use to, it's shorthand. I mean, in my opinion now, I could care less if people call me a Calvinist. It's just shorthand for what I just think the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
Right. There are obviously elements of Calvin's doctrine we don't apply, that we don't subscribe to, right? We don't baptize infants.
Right.
Things like that. So anyway, it's practical and it intersects, as you can see. We've already hit on soteriology, the Trinity, all of these things. But of course, this is going to bring up a question. And you did bring it up. George, what about all of the verses? You're telling me God doesn't change. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't ever learn anything. He's not acted upon without himself, right? He doesn't like we do. Like we are acted upon by how people talk, the things people do, and our whole life is really a response to external stimuli. But the Bible is very clear. God is not like that. And so you made that clear. You made your case. There are many verses, Psalm 102, Isaiah 46, like they're everywhere. James. But then they'll go, but George, what about all the times it says in the Bible that God relents or he repents?
Right.
So help us out there.
Yeah. I didn't bring it up, but one of the principles of Scripture is to interpret the less clear by the clear. And you can't get any clearer than Malachi 3:6, right? Where God says, I don't change. So when we come to in these places where it sounds like God has regret, it's in narrative. And so we need to be sure that we're interpreting things correctly according to their literary genre also.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't bring that up, but I was thinking about the fact that this Malachi 3:6 is Yahweh speaking for himself and saying, I don't change. And I think that these very explicit passages that are didactic or teaching passages, they should trump narrative passages when it comes to doctrine. We need to understand what's going on in the narrative by what's being said in
Mm-hmm.
the teaching passages. But there are passages where it says that God relents or he has regret. We can think about before the flood in Genesis chapter 6. It says that God regrets that he made man on the earth. 1 Samuel chapter 15, when Saul sins, God regrets that he had made Saul king.
Mm-hmm.
He relents in Jonah when the people of Nineveh repent. He relents of the disaster that he'd purposed against them. It's the same with the golden calf incident. He's going to destroy them, and Moses intercedes for them, and he relents. And so we've got these passages that seem to suggest that God's changing his mind.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to just ignore them. We want to try to understand them, and I think that we can. I think we can reconcile these passages in a way that's is true and helpful. So the first way that I think that we understand them is that the Bible often uses anthropomorphic language,
Mm-hmm.
which that means that the Bible uses language of man's emotions to talk about God.
Yeah.
And again, we're trying to understand the infinite and the eternal, but we're not. We're
Right.
finite and temporal, and so we've got this gap between us. So I use the example of my dog knows when I say sit to sit. She can understand like basic commands, but if I were to sit down and try to explain, philosophy, she doesn't. I'm not now thinking because she sits when I say sit that she's understanding English.
You never just sit on the back porch with the old dog and
I don't think I've ever
explain the
started
Trinity to her?
I don't know if I've ever waxed eloquent with my dog. I'm not under the impression that she knows English. She knows the tones, and she is a creature of habit, and so she knows these things. But when I think that the mistake that we make is we think that we're closer to God than we are to our animals.
Uh-huh.
Like, I have more in common with my dog than I have with God, because my dog is temporal and finite and is dependent, is a creature just like me.
Right.
Whereas God is other. He
Right.
transcends those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we often think that the separation between man and God is just by degrees.
Right.
Like God's up here on the top of the steps, and we're down at the bottom, but we're both on the steps. But that's simply not the way that God is being described. I mean, when we're talking about him being immutable and having aseity and being infinite, like those are not creaturely attributes that we can attain to.
Uh-huh.
And so the Bible is using language it's using creaturely language to explain to creatures the nature of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to understand that. We get the same idea when it talks about God's right hand. Like, does God have a right hand? When it says that he's angry, the Hebrew often means that he's like has smoking nostrils.
Right.
Well, are we to imagine that God has a body like us and that his nostrils are flaring because he's angry? No, the Bible is using anthropomorphic language to help us to understand. And so when we read about God relenting or having regret, it's not talking about his unchanging nature. It's presenting to us his displeasure at sin.
Mm-hmm.
So we can grasp what the Bible is saying to us when Saul sins against God, and it says that God regrets making him king. It's meant to communicate to us God's displeasure at Saul's
Right.
actions.
It's not meant to communicate that God made a mistake.
Right.
And he should have made someone else king.
Yeah. It's not. We're not supposed to think God's changing his mind and is like, oops. shouldn't have done that.
Right.
And that brings us into the second way, which is that God's relenting is not like ours.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to remember, and we didn't talk about this, but God is simple. And the first time I heard that expression, I was like, what are you talking about? God is simple.
Yeah,
God's like the most complex being.
Because we think it's like insulting. We think it's
Right.
like Lenny of Mice and Men.
Right. We think simple is to be, I don't know, to lower him.
Right.
But what we mean by simple is that God doesn't have parts,
Uh-huh.
and he doesn't have passions like we do. So at one moment I can be happy
Yeah.
or sad or angry. We go through all these different passions, these different emotions, and they shift. God doesn't do that. He's simple.
Right.
He is love. He doesn't have love. He is love.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't change from hate to love.
Right.
They're both just expressions of who he is,
Mm-hmm.
at all times, unchanging.
Right.
And so we have to remember that when we're looking at these relenting passages, we have to remember he's not like us. He's not complex. He's simple.
Mm-hmm.
He's not made up of a bunch of different parts.
Right.
So he's not happy with Saul, and then Saul does something, and he regrets.
Uh-huh.
Like he doesn't move from one thing to another. What this means is we need to understand the context of these passages.
Right.
I mean, you look at 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul sins, and it says God regrets that he made Saul king.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want to read that just by itself. We want to expand that to the whole storyline. And if we go back far enough, we go to Genesis 49, where God promises to Judah that the king is going to come from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
Well, where does Saul come from? He comes from Benjamin. So as soon as we read that Saul from the tribe of Benjamin is going to be the king, our like alarm bells should go off. Like we should be asking bigger questions than just, well, why does God have regret? We should be asking questions of what's the purpose of God choosing a king from Benjamin in the first place? What is God doing in the big story? Because we already know that the king's supposed to come from Judah. He's not supposed to come from Benjamin. So there's got to be a reason why God chooses a Benjaminite, and that connects to the end of Judges, where the tribe of Benjamin is almost wiped out because of the whole story with the Levite and the concubine, and they're like this wicked tribe that rebels, and there's civil war, and they're almost wiped out. And so when we see that Saul is a Benjaminite, we should be like, oh, that's not great. That's not a good description. The people are asking for a king like the other nations, and they get a Benjaminite, and that should be what we're looking at as we're looking at the story. Not thinking God made a mistake by choosing Saul, but that God is presenting a king like the other nations, so that when the true king shows up, the people will be like, this is the king that we need. We need the king that God gives us, not the king that we desire to be like the other nations. Same with Jonah. You got the people of Nineveh. They repent, and so God relents. Well, did God change his mind? Not if you read the whole story. Like if you read the whole story of Jonah, Jonah goes to Nineveh so that they will repent because God sent him. Like God's the one who initiates the whole thing. So when he relents, it's not like us relenting.
Right.
It's meant to communicate something more than just, well, the people change, so God decides that he's not going to do something.
Right.
And then that brings us to the third way to understand these relenting passages, and that's that the change, the apparent change, is actually not in God; it's in us. Like we're the ones who are changing. So when Nineveh repents, God relents, but it's not because God's changing; it's because the people of Nineveh changed. So Augustine, he used the example of the sun. Like the sun can warm you; it could give you a sunburn.
Right.
It can cause plants to grow, or it can wilt them. What's changing? The sun's not changing.
Right.
But the sun is the sun.
Right.
Spurgeon uses the same illustration. The same sun that hardens the clay melts the wax.
Yeah.
Right. Another illustration, I can't remember if it was Augustine or if it was Spurgeon. They both use all these illustrations to talk about God's unchangeableness. Another illustration was that of a pillar. If you go to a building that has a pillar, you can walk to one side of the pillar and you can see it from one angle, and you can go to the other and you can see it from another angle. But what's changing? It's not the pillar. It's not the pillar. It's you. You're the one who's moving, and that really is how we should understand these relenting passages. Is the change is not on God's side. The change is on us. We're the ones who are constantly changing, and it's just in our relationship to God that He relates back.
Right. Right. He is who he is all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It gets back to this simplicity, this idea of simplicity.
Yeah.
Right. We wrongly think about God like Thanos. That's the illustration I've used is Thanos collects all these stones and they all have like attributes of God. But once he gets them all, he's fully powered up. He's like God. Right.
Yeah.
But God's not like that. Like, so if you can imagine God distilled down to like something you could imagine, like you could say he's a fire, like a cosmic eternal fire in the MCU, right? And this plays back into what you talked about last week. Like fire can either destroy you and consume you, or it can purify you, and it can make you clean. It can and that's kind of what we get from the Bible.
Right.
That God is this eternal, consuming fire, and as we relate to Him, either we're dead in our sins and we experience bad news, we experience His wrath. Well, God hasn't changed at all, right? That's always His disposition toward that which is unholy and evil. We just don't like to think of ourselves that way. But through grace and the transforming power of the gospel, the same fire becomes a purifying fire,
right,
which transforms us into the image of Christ. But God's not the one changing there.
Right.
It's the same. He's the same fire.
Yeah, it's us.
Yeah,
we're the ones who are changing. And really, this was brought up by I think this was brought up by Stephen Wellum in his systematic theology. He said that really these relenting passages, they actually bolster immutability, the doctrine of immutability, because depending on how you act, you know what to expect from God.
Right.
If you repent, then you experience God's forgiveness. You experience His grace. If you are continue in rebellion, then you get His wrath. It's not Him who's changing; it's just you. you're changing, and where you are in your relationship with God, you know what to expect from Him,
right?
Because He doesn't change. So, and this ties directly into the question that the Israelites are asking in Malachi, like, where's the God of justice? He delights in evil because look at all the stuff that's happening. And they're not grasping that it's them who's changed.
Right.
God hasn't changed. They're just experiencing His displeasure because of their sin.
Right.
But He hasn't changed.
Sin
He's told them very clearly. He's revealed to them very clearly what to expect.
Right. Yeah, and from their perspective, right, they're thinking, oh, we came back to the land. Everything should be like it was before in the time of Solomon. But the other thing they're failing to grasp is sin has long-term consequences. So even though God has been faithful to bring them back and they have a temple, they're still having to pay tribute to all these surrounding nations, right? They're losing their wealth and all this stuff. And but God hasn't changed. They're just still experiencing the ripple effects. Maybe the pond, you throw a stone into a pond, it ripples. It's going to take a while for that ripple to play out until everything becomes still again. But that doesn't mean that God is like changed and He no longer cares about evil and injustice. But that's what the very thing they're accusing Him of having changed, which is how it fits in to this book.
Yes. Yeah. I think this verse and this doctrine, I think it's the central idea of the book. I think it fits into the entire thing. I think it's the doctrinal hook that everything else is hanging off of, because you get to chapter 1 and He says, I've loved you, and they say, how have you loved us? And what does He do? He takes them all the way back to Genesis, to choosing Jacob and rejecting Esau. And what's the whole point? It hasn't changed. My love hasn't changed from all the way back then to now. It hasn't changed. They're bringing blind, lame, sick, animal sacrifices because they have this idea that God's holiness has changed.
Yeah.
His holiness hasn't changed. Before the exile, after the exile, he still is a holy God. His justice hasn't changed. His truth hasn't changed. I think that this is at the heart of the entire book.
Yeah.
I think to understand the book and its core message is to remember God doesn't change.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's jump into the second and third points then. The second point then flows out of that. God doesn't change, and that's bad news. So why is that bad news that God doesn't change?
We continue into verse 7,
Mm-hmm.
and it says that from the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. So the problem with Israel is seen all throughout their history, and that problem is that they change. And so you just peruse the book of Exodus, and you can see this. I am getting ready to sneeze, Jay.
Let it out, George. Let it out.
I'm sitting here.
Let me mute your microphone real quick so you can do it.
I'm thinking that I'm getting ready to sneeze. No, it went away.
Okay.
So as soon as you name it, it goes.
Ah.
It flees. It's allergies. Have you been experiencing allergies the last week?
Mine haven't been that bad. But,
Really? Oh man, I'm sneezing.
Some
all
of
the time.
my family is.
Really?
Yeah.
I was outside this morning. It was not a good idea. Anyway, sorry about that.
You're so mutable.
Yeah. So we peruse the book of Exodus, and you can see this. God brings them out of slavery in Egypt, and they immediately start grumbling about food and water as if God's not going to provide for them.
Right.
Like God's goodness has suddenly changed. He brought them out of Egypt, but now he's not going to do good for them. He's just going to let them starve. They go to Mount Sinai and they get the law. They experience the theophany. They see the fire and the clouds and the lightning and the earthquake, and they actually hear his voice speaking to them. And they even say everything that God says will do. And 40 days later, they're worshiping a golden calf, as if God has changed.
Right.
That he's not holy anymore. Like he's not there anymore. Moses is gone, so God must be gone too. They go to the promised land. They get to the very border of the promised land, and they say, no, we're not going in because there's giants. As if God, who's brought them out of Egypt, and they've seen his power at Mount Sinai, and they've seen his goodness in the wilderness, and now they come to the border, and it's like they don't believe that God has the power to do this. Like he's changed.
Right.
And time and time and time again, it seems like their problem is that they are viewing God as having changed.
Right.
But who's changing? They are constantly. They're constantly changing, and that's the charge that he brings against them. From the days of your fathers, you have turned aside. You have changed, and that's all that they ever do. That's all that they ever do is that they're changing. But God says, "I don't change." And that's really bad news. That's really bad news for them, because God has promised good to them, but they're turning aside from his ways. And so what can they expect? Not good, but judgment. And his immutability means that his law doesn't change, that his justice doesn't change. His anger at sin, it doesn't change. And so where they're looking for the God of justice, and they think that he's going to come and just shower them with blessings,
right?
Even in the midst of their rebellion, what the doctrine of immutability tells us is that when he comes, he's coming in judgment against their sin. That's bad news,
right?
And it's not just bad news for them. God's immutability is also bad news for us,
right?
Because immutability means that the same God of the Bible is the exact same God of today. Like he has not changed at all. He is the exact same God. And I think we often forget that.
Right.
I think we think that there's been some kind of change. I mean, even the even the liberals, they say that the God of the New Testament is different than the God of the Old Testament. Like he's changed. He was wrathful in the Old Testament, but now he's all love in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And I think Christians can think the same way. I think they can think about God, maybe not explicitly, but just kind of the way that they read their Bible, the way some of the things they believe, some of the way that they act. I think they can think that God has changed. Like he's not the same God as he was in the Old Testament because Jesus is coming. So now he's changed. So we can have bouncy houses and do stupid things on stage and all kinds of nonsense because he's not the God of Mount Sinai anymore.
And tell people they're basically good.
Yeah.
And tell them the real problem is that they don't love themselves enough. That they're basically good, and once they learn that, God already loves them, and they need to learn to love themselves too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So they of course have to get rid of, because they don't believe that God's unchanging. They have to get rid of the doctrine of propitiation, or what do we say? A historical Christian view of the atonement, of what happened at the cross.
Yeah.
So all of God's attributes meet at the cross. And since God doesn't change, what you have in the cross is the most visceral, grotesque, public demonstration of God's unchanging nature, of his
all of his attributes,
of all of his wrath.
all of his attributes just kind of coalesce there at the cross.
Yeah, we only look at the cross as good news, which it is good news.
Yes.
And we'll get to that. But it's bad news.
Because of his simplicity.
Yeah, yeah. So it's bad news.
Yeah.
God destroys his son. Jesus does it willfully. And that, think about it. Still to this day, is there a worse public execution? There's not, than a Roman crucifixion. Awful, horrific. And that's the picture that we see, that God doesn't change, and that if you're in sin, in rebellion, and nobody thinks they are. That's the other problem. People think incorrectly about God. People think incorrectly about themselves. They're always the hero of the story. But that which was displayed at the cross, like imagine if you will, God were to just come to the earth in a theophany like Sinai, but it's global, like cosmic. They see this cloud coming, this cosmic cloud. People are like, oh, and it's like, oh, it's God. God's returned. He's going to make everything great. And like God's holiness encapsulates and filters through the earth in a physical time-space way. We would be like the guy who drank the chalice in Indiana Jones. Yeah. Everyone chose poorly, and everyone is just disintegrated by the pure goodness of God.
Yeah. Both of the villains in those Indiana Jones movies,
they get melted.
The Nazis in Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Nazis in Last Crusade, they both underestimate the holiness of God.
Right.
They think that they're going to have access to all this power by opening the ark, and they get their faces melted off.
Yeah.
The same God who crushed his son for the sins of his people is the same God who is going to crush unrepentant sinners on the day of judgment. The exact same God. That's bad news if you are continuing in your sin, because God doesn't change, and so you can try to ignore it. You can try to bargain with God by trying to do more good than you do bad. You can try to reform yourself and try to get on God's good side. It doesn't matter, because God doesn't change. He doesn't change. His holiness doesn't change. His standards have not changed. He still requires perfect obedience. He requires perfection. And if you're trusting in your own works, they're going to fail because you change. You can, look at people who make New Year's resolutions. This is going to be my year. I'm going to do all this. And then, a couple of weeks later, they've changed and they're not doing it, because we are just always subject to change. If you're trying in your own strength to be made right with God, you're going to change. Like your strength is going to fail because you are subject to change. It's bad news to try to be made right with God through your own works because you're just going to change. But God doesn't change, and that's bad news for you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also great news. It's also great news that God doesn't change. So on the one hand, it's bad news that God doesn't change. But on the other hand, it's the best news that you could possibly receive is that God doesn't change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's in the verse, right?
Yeah.
For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore, you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. And he tells them in verse 7, return to me and I'll return to you. So that's he's confronting these people who, like you said, they've come back to the land and they're expecting all these promises. This glorious rebuilt temple, and the Messiah is going to come, and he's going to conquer all of our enemies, and we're just going to be the crown jewel of the world.
Yeah.
And they look around, and it's Lawton, Oklahoma, and it's just not what you were expecting, right?
Yeah.
And they're disillusioned, and so they've decided that worshiping God isn't really even worth the hassle. They're just going to live however they want, and it's leading them to neglect worship and to live in just open rebellion against God. And if God, if they continue in this, the God of justice is going to come and he's going to burn them up. But even though the people change, God doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though the people deserve to be consumed, or the word carries the idea of being devoured or being brought to like an just complete utter end.
Mm-hmm.
And they deserve it because of their sin. They've deserved it since the moment that they came out of Egypt. They've deserved to just be consumed by God's wrath because of their sin. But even though they're constantly changing, God doesn't change. And that means that even though they may not believe it, they may not be expecting it, God's going to fulfill all of his promises, which includes everything that he said in chapter 3 up to this point. The messenger of the covenant is going to come, and he is going to purify the people. And all the promises that he's made about redeeming his people and conquering their enemies and glorifying them, they're all going to come true. They're all going to come true in Christ. And we talked about that last week, that this messenger who's coming, it's Jesus. And even though it's from our perspective, because we're living in time, we're having to wait, we know because God doesn't change that all of the promises are going to come true.
Right.
That there's not a single promise that God is going to fail to bring to completion because he doesn't change. And because he doesn't change, he also can't lie.
Yeah.
Like it's not just that God doesn't lie, it's that he cannot lie.
Yeah.
He is unable to because he doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of God's immutability, and here's where like the practical nature of it comes in, like how immutability affects all these other doctrines. It's because of God's immutability that Jesus had to come and die.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't think about that very often. We like to compartmentalize. I don't know if that's because of systematic theology or what, but we like to compartmentalize all these doctrines. But really, the atonement is connected to God's immutability.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't change in his justice and his holiness and his anger against sin, but he also doesn't change in his love and his compassion and mercy and his promises towards his people.
Mm-hmm.
And where those two meet is at the cross.
Yeah.
Like where God's justice is satisfied against sin, but also where his love and grace towards his people is also fully seen.
Right.
And it all is connected to the fact that he's decreed this from eternity past, that this is what he's going to do, and he doesn't change. And so in time, all of his promises come true in Christ.
Right. Yeah.
And that's good news for us.
Yeah, that's
right?
good news.
That's good news for us. because God is immutable, all these things are going to happen.
Yeah. And this is again, we come back to the absolute uniqueness of Christianity in the world, that God doesn't change, and therefore at the cross we see all of his attributes meet. Yes, all of his justice is there, but his grace and his mercy. And so we know we're interacting with the same God, right? When a sinner comes to God in humility through Christ, then they experience the same God, but in a different way.
Right.
Right? They're experiencing him in a different way than they would beforehand. When you think about, like, I heard this, I think it was John Lennox, mathematician at Cambridge, talking about he was being questioned by, I think he was at Harvard. So Harvard students questioning him about, like, why he's a Christian, how he knows Christianity is true, all of these things, And he had a really good illustration. He was like, look, I've studied all the world religions. I'd encourage you all to as well, to the Harvard people. And he would say Christianity is absolutely unique in all of the world's religions in this, that in all of the world's religions, you have kind of like this transactional hope. I don't know if he called it that, but that if you keep certain, like there's an initiation into that religion, right? And okay, now you're this, follow this path and follow these laws, follow these rules, and you're creating like credit, like religious credit for yourself. But you never know until the end if God will, if you actually do have a relationship with God or not, right? So that's the goal: eternal life, access to God. But you don't really know. You may be a Muslim, Hindu, whatever, until the end. You don't know. But in Christianity, at the beginning, you know. And here's the little illustration he gave. He's like, imagine, when I get, if I'm with my wife and I say, you know what, we could get married, but here's this book, a cookbook. And if you master everything in this cookbook, and after you've mastered it all, then I'll love you, and then I'll accept you as my wife, truly as my wife. And in Christianity, you come into this relationship at the first saying, I accept you for who you are. You're my wife. I love you. And by that initial transaction of that love, then the wife goes, you know what? I think I want to learn to follow this cookbook. I want to because he loves me. And so in Christianity, that's what you have. You have you, the sinner, coming to the holy God without bringing any religious transactions on your part, solely based on the work of Christ. And that's the unique part. Everything else is based on yours, but we come to him imperfect in our sin, solely based on the work of Christ, in God's love. And then we know at the beginning, not at the end, that we are his, that he does love us. And then based upon that already being accepted, that then leads to following the rules of Christianity, right? Absolutely unique.
Yeah.
Completely unique.
Just a couple of days ago, Tom Buck tweeted that Christians need to stop buying into this. You need to forgive yourself. You just need to forgive yourself.
Right.
Which is big in, modern psychology.
Yeah.
Like you need to stop living with guilt. You need to forgive yourself,
right,
of whatever it is you feel guilty about. And most of the comments that I saw towards the beginning when he first tweeted it were pretty good and in agreement. But there were some that are like, no, this has real psychological benefits. Like this. I mean, it's kind of piggybacking off of MacArthur's comments from a couple of weeks ago about different psychiatric problems. But really, this idea, and I think a lot of people buy into it, you just need to forgive yourself. To say you need to forgive yourself on one side is to ignore the fact that you're not the person who's been sinned against. Like you're not sinning against yourself, you're sinning against God. You need God's forgiveness.
Right.
On one side. So I think on the unbelieving side, the non-Christian side, to forgive yourself is to still be suppressing the truth in Romans chapter 1, suppressing the truth that it's God that you need forgiveness from. But on the Christian side, I think we need to get away from this. You just need to forgive yourself. because really what's going on is you are not accepting the forgiveness that comes through Christ.
Mm.
And so so on one side it's unbelief and suppressing the truth, but on the other side it's unbelief also. You don't need to forgive yourself. Like, that's not the next step. Well, I know God's forgiven me, but now I just need to forgive myself. What you need to do is you need to come back to divine immutability, that God doesn't change, that he said that if you confess your sins, that he's faithful and just to forgive you of your sins and cleanse you of your unrighteousness. And remember that God's word is forever true, because God never changes.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need to forgive yourself. You need to believe that because you confess your sin to God, that Christ forgives you.
Right. Yeah. We always find a way to put ourselves at the center of the universe.
We do.
Back at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
This is just another example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a Christian should have the greatest hope because of divine immutability. God doesn't change, so why should we despair? Why should we be downcast? Hope in the unchangeable God.
Mm-hmm.
The same God that we see in the Bible is the exact same God, not a mind. He hasn't changed. He hasn't shifted. There's no shifting shadows in him. He is the exact same God of Abraham, of Moses, of David. He's the same God that we see here in Malachi 3.
Mm-hmm.
Trust in him.
Yeah.
Trust in him. Hebrews chapter 13, it picks up on the same idea. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Yeah, and how amazing
He's
the incarnation.
He's unchanging.
We're talking about infinite eternality,
Right.
aseity.
Mm.
We're talking about all these big things, simplicity, like these big cosmic things, and God became a man,
Right.
and baby talk to us.
That is, I didn't have time to bring it up because that's getting more into. I wanted to try to keep it as close to application as I could,
Right.
because we can get lost. Like, this is a doctrine that we could just drown in. We could just get lost in.
Yeah.
One of the
Waterboard me in it, George.
Okay.
I'm ready.
One of the so we already talked about the regret passages. We didn't talk about prayer, but I brought it up in the sermon. But the incarnation is another problem that people present with divine immutability.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, creation is also one of the problems. Like, well, God started to create, so doesn't that imply some kind of change?
Uh-huh.
But the incarnation is one of the things that people bring up. Like, well, didn't God change?
Mm-hmm.
Like, didn't the second person of the Trinity change?
Right.
When he became incarnate? And I think that I think that there is like mystery to that.
Right.
Like, we like, if the incarnation was just something that we could easily explain and be like, oh yeah, like God became a man. Like, I think we have failed to grasp what exactly is going on. Like, we are talking about the infinite one, the eternal one, the one outside of time and space, entering into time and space and taking upon himself the nature of a man. Like, that is something that should cause us to stand in awe and amazement at our God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what other God does this? Like, you've got like the Greek gods. You've got Zeus, who he looks like a man, and he like visits people and acts like a man.
Yeah.
Acts like a sinful man. But you don't have anything like the incarnation.
Right.
Like, the Greek gods, they seem to exist in time and space.
Yeah.
They seem to be just exalted people, like superheroes. But that's not Yahweh.
Right.
Like, Yahweh actually does exist outside of time and space. And yet, in the mystery of the incarnation, the second person of the Trinity, he does take on humanity.
Right.
There is a mystery to that, but the nature and essence and attributes of God do not change.
Mm-hmm.
He takes upon himself a human nature, and that human nature experiences change.
Mm-hmm.
But the divine nature doesn't, and so we have the two natures in the one person, and we have to make sure that those are kept distinct.
Right.
like his humanity and his deity in one person, but there's not a mixture. And so even as the human nature changes, and he grows and he learns, his divine nature remains the same.
Right.
And so that's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there is mystery to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does the divine take on a human nature?
Without the divine nature changing.
Without the divine nature changing,
Right.
I don't know, but that's what the
always the
Bible
three.
teaches.
It's the three. Always the three paradoxes.
Yeah.
Sovereignty,
Mhm.
human responsibility, the incarnation, the Trinity. These are not contradictory statements. They're paradoxes.
Mhm.
So
Right.
one day we'll understand them fully, but
I don't know. Do you think that we'll understand it fully?
I think we'll understand the answer to those. I don't think we will understand God fully because, again, you talk about He's infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So we're contingent beings.
Right.
No matter even if we become
glorified,
eternal,
mm-hmm.
like experiencing eternal life,
yeah.
The distance still between a contingent being and God as absolutely.
Yeah, I was talking to one of our members after church, and I was talking about the fact that a lot of Christians, they talk about heaven as if will now exist outside of time.
Right.
And I don't think that's true, because we're creatures.
Well, as long
I don't think we'll be able to. I don't think we're going to be able to step outside of time, because we're, as creatures, we live in time. Like we will be able to know, like, this is when we were glorified. Like, we'll be able to look back.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, it's just we don't step into the infinite like God.
Right.
Like the new creation, new heavens and the new earth
will be in a place.
Seems to be a physical place, right? And if you have matter in motion, then you have time. So I could be like, George, meet me over the tree of life,
right?
And we're going to partake. When? I don't know, sometime in eternity.
Right.
Maybe we'll meet there. Maybe we'll keep missing each other.
Like,
it seems that it's just eternal.
It's just eternal.
Without end.
Yeah, right.
Forever.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But
we'll never fully grasp. We'll never,
right.
We can't.
Yeah.
We're created things, even if we are glorified and eternal. Yeah. And God is infinite. So by the time you like maybe you have in your mind, okay, there's infinity. When I understand God at this point, like you'll get there, and then you'll look and you'll be like, oh, that was a false peak.
Right.
There's another.
Yeah, you can't reach the end of.
There's another
infinity.
There's another eternity of God beyond this.
Yeah, you can't reach the end of infinity. That's what it means for Him to be infinite. There's no end. And I think that should cause us to worship. I mean, here's one of the applications of immutability is it's not meant just for your cold, abstract, dissecting of God to try to somehow figure Him out. It's so that you'll worship Him. Mm-hmm. Like, we have this timeless, unchangeable God. We ought to stand in awe of Him. We ought to marvel at Him in all of His attributes and His excellencies. And it should cause us to trust Him.
Yeah.
Don't live in despair. Don't live in unbelief. Don't live in rebellion and sin. Trust in this unchangeable God, this unchangeable triune God. It's something that we can, well, like you said, I mean, we'll be there for eternity, and we still will not have reached the end of the infinity of God. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Our good episode. Where we headed next week in Malachi?
Bring your checkbooks, because it's all about giving money.
We haven't. You know what?
Yeah.
We've been together for a while since our church was merged together, and I don't think we've really had any sermons on money.
I don't think we have in the 6 years.
We're the worst American pastors ever. Never preach on money. Only hit what some people think are the most important doctrines in the world when they come up in the text.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we'll spend 2 weeks on money. We've got this passage that is often used out of context that bring in the tithe, and God will open up the storehouses of heaven. And we'll examine the passage next week, and then in 2 weeks we'll do another topical sermon on whether Christians are commanded to tithe.
Yeah. All right, good stuff. All right, thanks for joining us today for the Conform to Christ podcast, also known as the greatest podcast on earth that no one's ever heard of. We hope this has been a blessing to you. If it has, give us a like, subscribe, share, maybe download the Christ Fellowship Church app. You can find all the episodes there. Share with your friends. Come back next time. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.